Hello, everyone. Is everyone back in the room? No one is missing any friends out from the market space? So, welcome back after the coffee and the sandwich. It was a really good start with the speakers here in the morning. Thanks for that. We will continue, and just for you to remember, if you have questions, write them down for the Q&A in the end of the day. And then I would like to welcome back Jeffrey to continue his presentations.
He was chuckling as he was watching Frederick. He says, I thought it was just you that threw paper when you were cutting. And I said, no, we all do it. So that was fun. That was fascinating. Thank you. I mentioned this thing and its use. And the front, we're all familiar with it. There's 14 inches, or I don't know what that is in centimeters, and 24 inches on the other arm. But then the back, there's all these funny little sections, and they're divided into 24ths and 12ths and 6ths and 3rds and 2/3 and halves and all sorts of stuff. And maybe you've never looked at this, but this was kind of an early calculator. We saw Frederick doing some math in his head, doing, okay, it's half of 37, which is 18.5, and half of that, and that. Halves, that's easy. But some of these systems wanted you to do even weirder math. This is an early American system. 5 foot 8 inches is the height, which is about 172 centimeters. The breast is 38 inches, which is about 96 centimeters. The waist is 86 centimeters, and the seat is about 101. And those are the only measurements you needed for this system. So we start at A and we square out, and then we go to 1, and 1 is the quarter of the breast on division plus 4 3/4. Now, what does that mean, on division? So if the breast was 38 inches, then the breast on division was half of that, which we'd sometimes also refer as the drafting scale, or in metric, the size. But if you had 38 inches and you had to do a quarter of that on division, so a quarter of 19 already is kind of complicated. So that's where this comes in. So you flip your ruler over and you look in the section where it says fourths, and you find the number 19, and you make your mark. And that's set up so that is a quarter of 19, or the breast on division. Plus 4 3/4, plus, why 4 3/4? Well, I guess it seemed like a good number, maybe. Okay, the waist was set at a quarter of the height, which, okay, I can buy, sure. The hip is 6 inches always. Why? What if he's this tall? What if he's Swedish? Why 6 inches? And then the neck width is 1/6 of the breast. So again, we're looking for 1/6 of 19, which would have been really complicated, but I can go to 1/6 and find 19. But why is the neck 1/6 of 19? Why isn't it part of his neck? It was just to make it easy for people to remember, so that you can just work with this and do as he did and draft. But as Frederick pointed out, why do we not do all these things anymore? Because they don't actually work. They may have worked for a small subset of people and in a few conditions, but one thing that Frederick kept repeating was depending on, if, or this, or that. There was a series of decisions that had to be made that we couldn't just squeeze into a ruler or a computer or a calculator or a one-page drafting system. There was sort of 20 years of accumulated experience of knowledge of fitting people and going, okay, if these conditions are met, then do that. If then. For every inch that the waist is bigger than the breast, do this amount. So if you know anything about computer programming, if-then statements and for loops, it's basically an algorithm. What's an algorithm? It's a process or set of rules to be followed in calculations or other problem solving, especially by a computer. So in theory, we could get a computer to do some of this stuff, if only we could manage to take the 20 years of accumulated experience and put it in a machine. I've developed my own drafting system and my own set of rules, and it just seemed easy. So at one point I was like, I need to make an algorithm. I need to put this into a computer. I need to make a system that can do it faster, do it for me. I'm thinking 4 years ago, the IACDE had a convention in Amsterdam. And while I was there, I was contacted by a group of young people who said, we'd like to meet you. We've been writing an algorithm. We've been developing software that can make patterns based on measurements. We've got an algorithm. I said, cool, okay. I'd heard this a number of times, and usually it didn't work, because usually it was people, they were lawyers or they were bankers or something, who said, how hard can it be to make custom clothing? Let's start a custom clothing line. Yeah. So I met with them, and they made me a suit, and I said, so there's some issues. And that's usually when they will go, oh my God, it's going to take 6 months and like $40,000 to rewrite 3 lines of code, and it can't be done. And instead, Ruben said, yeah, I'll have it done for next week. So we started working on a system that could draft based on a set of conditions and create production-ready patterns. Make all the linings and all the stuff that I hate doing, and could have a production-ready marker in the cutting room in about 17 minutes. But as we started to fit more shapes and more bodies, we started to realize that just using the tape measure was not going to work. That we had to start thinking about different types of measurements, different ways of measuring them. Like said it himself, my measurements and my system and my... So again, we have to start rethinking about how do we analyze the body, because it can start getting really complicated. And if we just work with a tape measure or maybe even a caliper, we can't accurately represent the shape of the human body in 3D space. So that's when I was like, guys, I think we need to start playing with 3D scanning. My first experience with 3D body scanning was 11 years ago, 12. The company I worked for bought 2 TC squared scanners for about $200,000 each, and we sent them to Costco stores. And I don't think you have Costco in Europe. Well, we sent them out, and we said, we're going to make custom suits by scanning people. And yeah, didn't work. Partly because we were still treating the scans as if they were just a body and we were putting a tape around them. And partly because we didn't consider the fact that maybe the computer wasn't going to recognize the landmarks of the body that we use, and so maybe the systems that we use wouldn't work. And partly because it wasn't taking into personal preference, and there were just a lot of conditions and a lot of things that at the time we couldn't figure out. And so the bean counters in the company said, we just spent a lot of money on something and it was a total waste of time, so we'll never touch this again. And I said, well, okay, no, it doesn't work now, but it will someday, I think, and we just got to keep working at it until, but it's hard to justify to bean counters spending money on something that doesn't actually work. It's great if you're an academic, if you work at a university or something, but how could I prove it to my employers that it's something we should continue working? Because to them, it was like I was asking them to take the red pill and step into the matrix. Body scanning. Ooh. The first thing we were asking ourselves is it's accurate? So we would scan somebody and we'd pull out a measuring tape and we'd put the measuring tape and we'd say, no, this guy is 106 centimeters and the scan said 104, so therefore the scan is not accurate. We'd put him in a booth, and so we've got a booth over here, and so that was the primary method of scanning people, where either you've got a whole lot of cameras in there or maybe just a few lasers. And the benefit to this is that it's very quick. It takes the measurements, it takes the scan, it does it. Either it's photogrammetry or it's laser, it's various technologies. But the point is, it's fast, but it's expensive. That's a lot of cameras or lasers. And it's not very easy to set up, especially if you get to the location and you don't have screws. Not that that happened last night. Then there's the turntable kind of scanner where somebody stands on a thing and it rotates, which is a lot cheaper, but it takes a little bit more time and people tend to move and breathe. Don't do that. So it's not as accurate as a booth, but it's still a lot more accessible, still a lot more mobile. And speaking of mobile, now we have mobile devices. We can use our cameras, we can use LiDAR technology to scan people. I mean, at least in theory. Then there's the way we always do it. That's the worst thing in our company, but we've always done it this way. So this year, a study was released coming out of a number of universities called A Comparative Analysis of Anthropometric Methods Past, Present, and Future. They took 1,100 body scans and 14,000 measurements, because they were setting out to assess the compatibility and repeatability of different body measurement extraction methods. You remember I mentioned about the whole using the Earth as a standard, because that makes it repeatable, that every time you do this operation, you get the same result. So part of this was that we want to see if we scan a person a number of times, are we going to get the same result, or is the scanner going to give us different results? They also address the fact that there are no common practices, there are no standards, among technology suppliers for assessing and reporting the performance of these systems. So, each subject, each person had 11 measurements collected, twice, by each measuring system or measurer. They went on to state that 3D surface imaging has gained popularity due to the fast speed of contactless measuring, but also the ability to acquire measurements that are not attainable through manual means. So what I was saying about, how we represent this shape in space, well, if we stop thinking merely about tapes, if we measure things a little differently, maybe we can get the shape right. But if I'm going to measure differently, I need to draft it differently. I need a different system. So this was done in 2 phases. The first phase, they used 2 booth scanners and 4 expert measurers, meaning 4 people with a measuring tape. And then in phase 2, which was done in Europe, they used a body scanner booth, a turntable, 4 mobile apps, and 2 expert measurers. They've actually published the data online. You can find all 14,000 measurements on the website. They published out there for future study. We can go find the measurements. We can also find all the body scans. So here's phase 1. And actually, I'm going to try to go to Blender. Things can go wrong. Because I want to show, when you're starting to look at body scans, rather than pull out the tape, come on. I see, yay, okay. Now these were 4 years ago, 5 years ago. They were both booth scans. So when we're talking about pure machine vision and just using what the cameras see, we have issues. Her hair was too dark. It couldn't see the top of her shoulders. It couldn't see under her breasts and under her stomach, or her hands, or her feet. So there's holes in this mesh. So if a computer's going to try to look at this and extract measurements, or if we're going to try to take this into V-Stitcher and fit it, it's not going to work. We're going to have to do stuff to this, a lot of stuff to this, to make it work, to make it usable. So then there was another booth scan, which is more complete, but it's got, her legs are connected, and her arms are connected, and then there's these little funny black spots. They're shading artifacts. They're vertices that are not doing what they're supposed to do. So what's going to happen if we try to measure? It's not going to be able to measure the thighs correctly. If this mannequin was connected down to here, I'm not going to be able to put a pants on it either. So, I mean, obviously the technology has advanced since then, but these are things that you need to start to look So typically when we scan, you'll see that most of them are using the A-pose, because in theory, you're not going to have the webbing, you're not going to have the mesh. But we saw that we still did. So some vendors are suggesting we go to a T-pose, because then you don't have the connection you don't have down here. Problem, though, is that if I measure this mannequin from nape to wrist, the sleeve length is 85 centimeters. If I raise his arm, it's 73 centimeters. That's a 12 centimeter delta. But is that actually what's going to happen in real life? Maybe. We've got to test it out. I mean, certainly, when you start thinking that way, okay, what happens when my arms move? Well, it's not just the sleeve length, the chest circumference is going to change. The shoulders are going to change. What else is going to happen when somebody's in a booth in A-pose? That's not accurate. That's not how it is. So how do we get around that? And again, I'm going to try to go to Blender. Let's open. Because here we have a whole bunch of them. And this is the same person from 6 different mobile apps. Well, no. So a turntable that we saw, 4 mobile apps, and a booth. And so let's just have a little look. This one, I mean, we can imagine that this is actually what the person looked like. This next mobile version, if we have a look at it, it's not looking too far off, but it's not obviously the shape, so we have to wonder how accurate that's going to be. This other mobile version, we're getting really further away from what that person looks like, but then what they've done in order to get around some of the webbing is they've carved out underneath her arm. Okay, but what happens if you're going to try to measure the circumference of the bicep? It's pretty even mesh. There's some strange vertices. But what they've done and they're starting to do is instead of going from that pure computer vision and taking just what the camera sees, they're saying, okay, how do we reconstruct the missing parts? Because you need what we call a watertight mesh, without the holes, without the things to accurately reproduce. So maybe we take a mesh that we've created beforehand and then take what the computer sees and try to deform that mesh to match what the computer saw, which is a way of getting a much more realistic or more usable result. This is another type of scan solution. They use more of a statistical analysis model. It'll look at the body, it'll compare it to a huge database of scans that they've done and say, okay, this resembles mostly that person. So we'll take, if we look at her mesh, it's very neat, very clean. It's obviously been preformed, and they're just going to morph this mesh to what they think is the shape of the body. But when you're relying on statistical analysis, and I mean, and this one is better because originally they were perfectly symmetrical. They're thinking in terms of how do we use 3D scans for size recommendation. If somebody's online, they're trying to buy something and they don't know what size to pick, and so they say, okay, take 2 pictures of you, and we'll tell you what size. Okay, great. It works for size recommendation. But for us, partly because I need the actual shape of the person, not something that maybe we think. If I'm making a custom suit for somebody, it's got to fit them, not what the computer says, well, this is what everybody else is kind of sort of like you. It also relies on the user to enter a correct height and a correct weight. And you'd be surprised how many people, myself included, don't know what our actual height is. Let's look at this next one. So this is a booth scan. It looks a lot like the original turntable scan. The only, there's some, nope, the feet are cool. So it's not a bad scan. And then this one, we still have some of the webbing. We still have some of the webbing under the underarms. We have some of those spare vertices that are doing weird things. So they took the measurements, and then each of these people were also measured by expert measurers, and that's the gold standard, right? Oh, I'm going to switch back. So what they found in this study was that the accuracy and repeatability errors of traditional anthropometry were extensively reported. They're saying we're not very good at taking measurements. They said that manual measurements are not a suitable gold standard, there's that word again, against which 3D imaging systems can be compared to determine accuracy. So if I can't take my tape out and measure somebody, how do I know that that booth is giving me the right information? Remember, it's almost impossible to take a measure that's indisputably correct. They found that digital measuring methods can reduce much of the error associated with traditional data acquisition. So rather than us saying, are the machines right, they're basically telling us we're wrong and they're more correct. So what I do is, they come to me, they say, I've got this thing and it works and it's perfect and accurate. I'm like, oh yeah? Come here, Biff. And so instead of taking the tape out, I look at the shape. These are both supposed to be scans of him. I broke the system. But I send it back to them and I give them some information saying, I hope you can come back. And because what they then go is like, well, he doesn't fit into our model. We don't have a lot of scan data that fits what he looks like, and we just don't have the data, but it fits really well for you. Yeah, but I can find clothes. In my business, the people who come to me for custom clothes, most of them are coming to me because they can't buy clothes, because they've got a weird shape. They don't fit into that model, so I need that shape. I almost don't care about the measurements. I need the accurate shape. So I started looking at shapes rather than measurements. Am I seeing what I need to see? So right around the start of the pandemic, I've got a number of side businesses, I don't sleep. And we were doing custom clothing for women, and we were sponsoring a charity event, and the prize was a custom suit. And a woman won a custom suit, and she said, great, when can we start fitting? And I said, well, we just closed for COVID. Come back in 2 weeks. Because we were only supposed to be shut down for 2 weeks, right? Remember? 2 weeks to flatten the curve. How did that work out? And so a month later, she's like, okay, about my suit. Yeah, okay, so I'm still not going to measure you, still not going to fit you. And then things started to drag out, and she's like, yeah, my suit. So I said, okay, there's this new app on a phone, and I want to test it out, and so if you're willing to have some fun with me, it may work, it may not work, probably won't, but as long as you're good with having a suit that doesn't quite fit, she's like, hey, let's do it. So I scanned her with my phone. This was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Missing a lot of data. Missing a lot of stuff, but I was able to recreate a mesh and clean it up and create something that I could work off of and make a suit. And not knowing what was going to come out, I delivered her suit, and there were some issues, but generally she was happy with it. So I was like, maybe we need to spend some more time developing this. So I'd also started a project with my husband because he couldn't get clothes. He was like, well, there's more people who can't get clothes. Let's make a business. So again, during the pandemic, he said, well, I'm best man in a wedding, and the groom can't find a suit. Surprise. Can we do something? And I said, well, he's going to have to scan himself. So we used another solution, and we had it scan himself. And at this point, Ruben had come over to the United States, and we were still working from home, so we were down in my basement. I set up a place next to me, and we were there morning till night, 7 days a week for a month. And one of the projects we were working on was this, because at the same time as we needed to fit this guy and figure out some rules, and I had created a set of patterns, a first generation of patterns for these guys with weird shapes. But then I was starting to get more data, more scans, more things that we could work on. So we worked on a second generation of the pattern and looked at some of the assumptions we had made and figured they were wrong. and some of the things that were leading us to think that, so it's kind of telling me I need to do this thing, but that's against the rules of tailoring. We shouldn't do that. And we were like, well, if it works, why not do it? So again, we didn't measure him, we didn't fit him, we crossed our fingers. You know, when you do that for a wedding, that's maybe not smart. But it worked out. He was happy, he was thrilled. And so he said, we got to spend some more time on this. So it became a thing. We started another line of clothing. But we also looked at, okay, so the typical grading rules don't work. If we're going to make patterns and grade them, how do we do it? And we didn't have data. All we had was maybe some scans of things, and we just went searching online for more scans of bodybuilders, and you'd be surprised what you can find online. But we started looking and fitting and measuring and seeing, and surprisingly, we could make other sets of assumptions that didn't always completely work, but generally fit a pattern. So we came up with a new set of grading rules, and it'll keep evolving as we get more data and more scans. And but it also, we got to the point where we were creating a jacket draft. Okay, great, now somebody wants a vest or a shirt. Well, shit, we got to start over again. Because it was just a jacket draft, and the rules of drafting jackets are not like the rules of drafting shirts. And so I said, okay, maybe we're thinking about this wrong. In tailored clothing, we're not super familiar. We don't use slopers a lot. And I don't know if you know what the word sloper in English means, but it's a base pattern that basically is just a second skin of the body. An upper body, lower body, sleeve draft. The theory is that if you've got a sloper, you can develop a jacket off of this. You add 2 centimeters here, 2 centimeters here. There's a set of rules which are predictable and constant, relatively, that you could take a sloper and develop a garment off of that. So I said, well, okay, instead of trying to fit the jacket and fit the vest and fit the shirt, what if we come up with an algorithm that will create a sloper that'll fit? And then in theory, if we develop patterns off the sloper, then whatever we develop off of that will fit. But we were having issues of going back and forth between 3D software and pattern measurement, and though we had a really great solution for parametric pattern designing, fantastic, works great, but you got to convert to DXF to get it into another system, and God, I hate DXF. So I said, okay, we got to start over. I'm going to start developing a script in AccuMark, Gerber, which is the system I use for making patterns, and come up with a sloper. And so I wrote the script of like 300 lines of code that would make a sloper. We put it on the dummy, and AccuMark actually has a pretty good simulation engine. It's not, I wouldn't use it as a creative tool, but for fitting a pattern, it's pretty good. But I'd fit it, you know, in my size 6, which is, I guess, like a European 38, I think. And then I'd go, okay, now I've got to fit on a different size, and then things would fall apart. And so I would go back to, say, the scan provider that I was working with and say, okay, now I need a new point of measure. And then they'd go, oh God, it's going to be 6 months of changing code and stuff. And well, eventually they'd come back with a new point of measure, and I'd have to sort of guide them through it. But I started to think that, okay, I'm spending all this time developing these points of measure with these guys. And then they're going to come along and they're going to get acquired by Brooks Brothers or something, and I'm going to lose access to the data, so what's going to happen? And also, like, this was starting to get really annoying and really expensive, that I'm constantly having to come up with new points of measure. So I started thinking that maybe we need to figure out ways to acquire our own measurements. And then so we started looking at systems that were available that could take basically any scan and extract measurements from it. And I worked with them a little bit, and they even got around to, we can now take slices and take different kinds of points of measure, but I was still dependent on them. So we started looking at, how do we create a system that we can extract our own measurements? How can we automate it? Which is actually kind of complicated. But we started working on setting up ways that we could semi-automate the process. Because as much as we both wanted to completely automate everything, there's a story in Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, about, I forget the details exactly, so I'm going to get it wrong, but basically said, you know, Google was really excited to announce that their supercomputers had managed to look at thumbnails of YouTube videos and identify a cat with 75% accuracy or something like this. And everybody was like, wow, we're so cool. And someone said, Any 4-year-old can do that with 100% accuracy. So why did you just spend $100 million? His point was that computers are really good at certain types of things and not so good at others. And humans are really good at certain types of things and not so good at others. So maybe trying to automate everything start to finish is not the best approach. Maybe instead of trying to automate the entire measurement extraction process, I'm spinning my wheels. Maybe I still need a human being to look at it and go, yeah, that looks like the right level of the waste. Or no, that's like sitting somewhere in, the computer misidentified it, but that's just rolls of fat. So maybe we need to change our approach a little bit. So I came up with a sloper that worked for size 6, and then I got into another one. And thank God for Alvanon, because I didn't have access to a ton of people that I could do fitting all the time. And my husband was like getting a little bit tired of being a guinea pig. But I needed to make sure this was going to work, not just because I didn't want to fit just the little skinny women. Okay. And I did not want to have somebody to come to me and say, okay, I'm going to scan. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, we can't scan you because you're, no. It had to work. And not just women, for men too. So a lot of the assumptions we made about locate the apex of the breast point, well, maybe it isn't there. And then we started thinking, well, maybe that's not even the widest part. Maybe their stomach's wider than breast. So maybe we have to rethink about the whole system, everything we do. And we're starting to get to a point where this was straight out of the algorithm onto a 52. And then, so that's an American size 40, which I think is like a US or a European size 60. But we're getting to the point where the algorithm's pretty stable. Now the next stage is, okay, let's develop patterns off this thing, and then let's fit them onto actual real people. So when we found this data set of all these scans, I was like, oh, we have like 1,100 body scans of people that we can fit to. We can start playing, we can start experimenting, we can start coming up with our own rules and our own measurements. So a word about format for those of you who want to try it and you're not familiar with what you're going to get back from this scan. OBJ is the most common format, but it's somewhat limited. So if I've got somebody scanned like this, they're static like this. So aside from the measurement problems we talked about, okay, if I'm going to fit a jacket on them, this is not how I'm fitting a jacket. I need the arms like this. With OBJ, you can't do that. FBX is typically rigged and posable. Now, we'll look at what rigging and posing means in a second. But that's where I could take this and turn it into this. So if you have the choice, that's what you want to be looking for. Some of them are giving us STL files. STL is stereolithography, and it's a format that's used in 3D printing. But I don't know of a single 3D solution that we would use that supports STL. So if you end up getting one of those, you've got to take it into Blender or something else and convert it into a format. So, which brings up the point of, a lot of us as pattern makers, we're used to saying, okay, I use AccuMark, we use Gerber, we have Gerber cutters, I'm in the Gerber ecosphere. Or I use Lectra, and all my stuff is Lectra, and I only use Lectra. Once you get into 3D, and we all do when we're starting it, it's just sort of like, so what do I use? Do I use Claude? Do I use Browser? Do I use... There's no single solution that's going to work for everybody, and there's no answer. And if you came to me and said, what should I use? I wouldn't be able to tell you because I don't know what you do. As Andreas Seidel mentioned, like we all work completely differently and different needs. So you've got to look at all the different solutions and make a decision for you, knowing that that solution may not always work all the time for you. That there's other products out there that you may need to be able to use. And if you look at the world of 3D stuff in general, the guys who make video games or make movies, they don't use one system. They use like 6. You know, if you're doing digital image manipulation, you wouldn't use Illustrator, and you wouldn't use Photoshop to do vector art. There are different tools that are really good at certain things, and you're going to have to start getting at least aware of them Because even if you don't do data manipulation, maybe you need to know a little bit about what somebody's going to do so you're not formatting all your stuff in a way that they can't use. There's a lot of the world of 3D that we as technical designers, we may not need to know what UV mapping is all about because we won't do some of that stuff. But UV map, there's probably nobody better than a pattern designer to set up UV mapping. And so when you're starting to learn about 3D, there's a whole lot of stuff that you may say, I don't need to know that. It's best if you do. It's best if you start learning. But it's tough because if you want to go out there and learn, I mean, it's better now. When I started trying to do this, and in order to find out one thing, how to do something, I had to watch 40 hours of videos about making spaceships and robots and stuff for video games just to get that one little nugget of information that would be relevant to what I was doing. So I'm hoping that events like this and the 3D summits and this kind of thing will package the world of 3D and help us develop and work in it, because that information's not out there for us. So we have to be sort of working together as a group, working with the vendors especially, and especially, you know, working with their systems and breaking it and going to them saying, I broke it, I need you to fix it. We were working with Adobe, who was a sponsor of one of our 3D summits, and I said, guys, you know, you've been in the 3D game space forever, you're the accepted norm, like you're the industry standard for 3D games, but it falls apart when I try to do my stuff because I do all my stuff in plaids, and plaids aren't square, and your whole system is built on a perfect square. So I want to put a plaid, it falls apart. And they went, yeah, well, our whole infrastructure is based on that, so tough. Okay. So a few months later, we were actually at the 3D Summit, and the head guy from Adobe, their technical person, was presenting, and he said, oh, I need to mention, there's this new feature we're about to drop that we developed. We actually codenamed it the Jeffrey because we used your video to develop this thing. We looked at what you were doing, and we came up with something. I was like, they actually listen. Wow. They actually listen, so we have a duty to go to them and say, this is what you need to do to make it work for us. Because I will go with them, and I need plaids, and there's things specific to what I do, but I don't, you know, if I'm making intimates, that's a whole different ball of wax. They need soft surface, there's a whole bunch of other things that I would never think of. And then somebody else who may be doing another set of, they're making yoga pants or something, there's a whole bunch of other problems that I wouldn't think of, that they wouldn't think of. So we got to get there and work with them. And they're listening, mostly. And if they're not listening, find somebody else. So here's where things get really interesting. So I've got a scan, and I want to take it into VStitcher. But it's stock. It's an OBJ format, and I need it like this. So what do I do? So I could go into Blender, and I could create an armature, and I could put all the bones and things in places. I could do all this stuff. It's a whole lot of work. Or I could do something really fun. And this is real time, kids. Mixamo. And I need to log in. So it's free, but you need an Adobe account, so it's going to ask me to sign in, and it's going to send a thing to my phone. So this is a guy that I was working on earlier. We're going to do a new one. So I've got my scan. Let's go find one. Where is he? There. At this point, I should be talking and filling space, but I'm really not good at working and talking at the same time. I don't know, like Frederick, I couldn't have done that. Like I'd be working on my patterns, but ask me to speak, I can't. Because if you ask me a question, I stop and I answer, then I go back and I go, what was I doing? I don't remember. We need some music. So, let's turn them around. This is very similar to what you'll find in vStitcher where you're bringing an avatar. They've got anchor points where we've got to set similar things. So because this is a scan, I'm going to uncheck use symmetry because he's not perfectly symmetrical. And all I have to do is I'll place his chin and place his right wrist. And I could have recorded this beforehand so everything would go smoothly and edit out the mistakes, but I was like, that's no fun. We've been watching recordings on Zoom for 2 years. Like, I want something real. And like when we watch America's Got Talent, we don't just want to see the perfect performances. We like it when they crash sometimes. So it takes a minute, but considering the amount of time I would have had to have spent if I was doing this manually to rig this armature, it would have been taken forever. So not only is it really quick, it's also free. It says, our auto rigger algorithm, are you actually, okay, good. I was like, maybe they're not seeing it. I've done that before. I've been like demonstrating something and somebody's like, yeah, we're not seeing your screen. Yeah, I think it was Anna. She's laughing. Oh, wow. I do have a file set up just in case this doesn't work. But I'm hoping. Oh, there we go. So, we have a character. And what's really cool is not only can I download this like this. Somebody was saying, what can we do if we scan my body? I don't remember who I was talking. She was like, can I scan? Can I use it in software? I'm like, not only can you use it in software, you can make it dance. So that's all fun, but I'm not going to fit him dancing hip hop, so I'll go back to T-pose. Put him in T-pose. And download. So when I'm downloading this in FBX format, not only am I getting that skeleton that they've created that I would need and that I would have had to have done manually in Blender, but if I wanted to download that animation too, I could have done that. So if you're getting into animations and things and you're working with creatives who are like, okay, I don't want to see a guy just standing like this. It's one way to grab poses and grab animations to bring into vStitcher or other software to animate. So, and then you can look like you're like this 3D ninja. So let's go into vStitcher. And I'm going to import what we just did. So there's the guy we just downloaded. And I'm going to have to set some anchor points, so bear with me. And feel free to yell at me if I'm doing this wrong, browser people, because I'm probably doing it wrong. And again, he's not symmetrical, so I have to do it. I'm not good at typing. So I can save him. Now, I'm not going to fit him like this either. So now what I can do is I can go into the pose and I can add a pose, and it's brought that skeleton in. So I can now click on these joints and move his arms. And if I happen to know he's been doing this and I've got a photo of his actual posture, I can also fix some of that. And then I'll call this regular pose. So now I can start measuring, because remember, I don't want to rely on the measurement companies or the scan companies to give me my measurements. So how am I going to do this? I always forget, I need a garment, new outfit, new garment. We go into tools, and there's 3D measurements. And I can start creating the points of measure. You remember I was discussing creating my own points of measure to create my algorithm, because when I go into Gerber, I need everything named a specific way so the system will read it correctly. So I will try to set up my measurements in the same way. What I like to do is I start with some landmarks. So let's say chest circumference. And this one is going to be a circumference measurement. And this one I want perfectly horizontal to the floor. So I'm going to go in and drop it. And it's moving around and jumping around. It's a little tricky, but I just need to right-click. And now I get a little widget. And I can move it up and down and place it where I think it should go, not some computer has decided that it should go there. Now, it sees some webbing when I go up, so I drop it just there. And looks good. So then I'm going to add, this one we'll call it a coat waist, because that's what we in America call this circumference right here, which also I'm going to make parallel to the floor and just drop it down about there, which is not like the trouser waist, which is a whole other thing. And then we'll add hip circumference. Just move it up a little bit. And then we start getting into some other landmarks. And because I don't have points and lines and center front and all sorts of things, I got to start being a little creative about how I identify them. So I could create, let's say, a neck circumference. And I'll drop it. Let's put it there. And then we'll go and create a sigh. This one is usually a little tricky. So if I just drop it there, then we can play around. Sometimes I have to do it a couple of times. And I may even have to move his arm around. But some of these that are absolutely required for getting a precise measurement, I wouldn't so easily be able to do on a body. When I was taking out Sharpie markers and marking Biff up all over the place, he didn't appreciate it. Oops, what did I do? Well, let's just leave it there for now. So I want to actually see these, so I'm going to go click on show, because they're going to start becoming the basis for some of my landmarks. So now I want a shoulder length. And this one is going to be a tape point shoulder to be, let's say, there. So I've got my shoulder length, but now I also have a reference point that I can start using for, say, high point shoulder to, and I'll still call it apex even though it's not. And we'll still say, oh, I don't see a shoulder there. So now I have a, whoops, I did that wrong. Let's, it's hard to type on stage. So I can start creating more points of measure, and if I name them correctly, I could use that in my system. But I can also start doing fun things like, we talked about the neck being 1/6 of the breast, which makes no sense. So I could take the circumference, but then I'd really still be getting into doing some funky Euclidean geometry, because the neck is not really a cylinder, the shape is different, so I'd have to start calculating. But I found that if you start taking some straight measurements, let's call this neck width, and going from here to, say, here, it gave me 16.8 centimeters, okay. I can start drafting for a neck width a different way. And instead of using the breast, I've used that actual width. And I can do the same from front to back. Or let's say we want to talk about, waist suppression. And on here, it's not as big a deal as if I'm working with some of these plus-side models where you've got all sorts of shapes and curves, and you really need to think, okay, they're not balanced. You need to locate, and maybe the hip line is not the fullest point is not at the same place in the front as the side of the back. You have to be able to adjust and adapt your draft method, and also just look at volumes differently. Let's call this chest width. I did something wrong. I'm not used to centimeters. I put in centimeters for Ruben because he's going to be using my computer. And now I look at this and I have no idea if the number's right or not. Let's do waist width. So now I've got the width of the chest and the width of the waist, and that's maybe a better way of calculating the waist suppression rather than saying just like half of the breast circumference less half of the waist. Because I can actually look at it and say, well, we really are trying to shape that. So maybe my darts and my seams should resemble that shape more than just applying half of the value here, half of the value there. So it's this kind of process that, and as you go and as you work in it, and it works for this guy, and then all of a sudden I take it onto my size 40 US women's, all of a sudden certain things break. How do I re-examine that, and how do I make it work for all of them? And maybe I can't. Maybe it'll get to the point where I'd love to be able to make it work for everybody, but I can't. Because maybe I want to start making clothes for people who, they don't just have one arm that's longer than the other, but maybe they only have one arm or only one leg, and the computer system's looking and it's confused because it's looking for both arms or looking for both legs or looking for things that don't exist, so I have to be able to adapt to that. And that's where I think, maybe soon it'll work. A large portion of what I'm telling you this weekend is going to be wrong in 6 months. Not because it's necessarily wrong now, but because the technology is starting to advance at such a pace. The hardware that was required for this up until now was so expensive, and every season they drop a new generation, you get 9% improvement in speed for another $4,000 or something. And then NVIDIA came and broke the world last time when they dropped their new generation of GPUs, which are the brains for 3D. And the 30 series was suddenly so much better than the last generation. We could do new things. And then they announced the 40 series, and Biff was like, oh, you're not going to buy another one, are you? But I was thinking, well, maybe they'll be like 75% better than the last generation. They're supposed to be 3 times as fast. So all of a sudden, the kind of calculations and the kind of computations and the things that we couldn't do before because it just took too much and too many computer resources, they will be possible. And maybe the fact that I was going to tell you that I would then take these measurements from Browseware into AccuMark, because Browseware doesn't have the pattern-making functions that I need to do this, and maybe they'll go back and they'll come back 6 months from now and say, ta-da, here's all your pattern making. So what I told you about, I have to go back to Gerber. Maybe that's going to be wrong too. So with 3D, it's you kind of sort of tell yourself that today I know nothing. I need to learn everything new today, because chances are what I thought I knew is wrong. So as long as you approach this with the idea that it's moving, it's developing, don't paint yourself into such a corner that you can't get out of it. That I could spend so much time and so much money setting this thing up and have this great plugin that I think is going to change the world, and then somebody comes out and says, we've already done it, here it is, there. But here's another thing that's really cool. So I'm setting up this point, and I'm typing these things, and I was making tons of mistakes, and it was really tedious, and I needed a whole lot of points of measure for AccuMark to make my script run. Cool thing about Browseware is that they've got this open format. They'll expose the API, which for non-computer people means they're showing you under their skirt. It means if you're clever, or if you have money and access to somebody who's clever, I could create a plugin that instead of me having to type these points of measure all the time, it could generate that for me. It could start to automate some of the process, some of the tedious stuff. Because there are some things that I'm not going to expect it to place the waist at the right place, but it would be really nice if it set up all the words and it's all formatted, that I could then export to AccuMark. The measurements are there. I run my simulation. I've got my sloper. I pull it into AccuMark 3D. I fit it in AccuMark 3D. Then I write another script to generate a jacket pattern, simulate it again. It fits right. Great. Now bring it back into Browseware. Now I can simulate it, make it look really pretty, and show the client. And then maybe Browseware is going to come back and they say, okay, we just replaced all that you were doing over there. We can do all of it over here. It's not that I'm throwing you a wish list. I kind of am. But theoretically, with the right tools, because Browseware opens it up, I could theoretically create this algorithm within Browseware. Then I could do my fitting. I could do all this stuff and not have to go in and out from different platforms. And do it all there, to eventually then send a simulation to my website with some real-time rendering. Because you know what? Horn buttons, who knew they were so complicated to render in 3D? And mother of pearl, like we're getting into subsurface scatter and all these things that are really hard and really complicated until NVIDIA drops the 40 series cards, and maybe now it'll be easy. And so suddenly stuff we couldn't do, and I had to do like 60 renders of something because I need static images for my 3D configurator. Well, suddenly we can do it in real time, so it all changed. You're wrong. So it really opens up a world of if I've got some clever people and I can work up, I can create plugins. I can customize this thing to work the way I need it to work, and fit into the ecosphere. And if I understand the other platforms, if I understand that when I open things in Blender, the units are not the same. Because we think, okay, 3D, it's all, it's a person, it's a height, it should be standard. We shouldn't open it in any software, and it's always this. There's no standards. I may be working in millimeters in one, and then I bring it into Blender, and Blender's in meters, so suddenly my avatar is like 640 kilometers tall. And we're talking about standards in terms of scanning people. There's no standards. They're not the same. The vendors provide all sorts of things. They're working on it. And then we'll talk about some of the other things that need to be standardized and are not, because we've got physical parameters and optical parameters that work one way in one system and work in another. And if we're trying to really have a pipeline and a flow of stuff, we're not there yet. So you need to understand 6 different ways of doing things. But maybe in 6 months that'll be wrong. Maybe it'll work. 2 months? 2 weeks? Oh, 2 minutes. Wow. Swedes are impatient. Oh, are you telling me I have 2 minutes? Wrap it. Oh, she's saying, shut up, you're talking too much. Anna told me I'd better stop talking. Okay, I'll stop talking. Do we have time for a couple questions, or we leave them to the end? Are there any questions? They're all afraid of you, Anna. Sure. Are we getting really real here? Well, we're starting to do this right here, and with the 3D summits. It's getting people exposed. One of the things I think was the most brilliant about the 3D summits that we put on is that the vendors, thank you, make some of their tools available to people, because that was another issue I ran into, is not only I can't find the information, but I can't afford a $15,000 up-to-text license. I can't afford a $14,000 AccuMark seat. So if my bosses say you're not going to learn it, and I want to learn it, I'm kind of stuck. If I was working in Maya or some of the other things, they've got the indie licenses. So the fact that you've put an indie license out there, the fact that it's going to end soon, it makes me hesitate to really put on my things, because it keeps, getting extended. But it's hard for me to say I'm going to really invest my time in something that's only good for 3 months. But it's an amazing start, and that's one of the things that we need. We need to be able to get our hands on these things and play with them and try them. And then, as that develops, people are starting to put information out there, starting to do it. But the conversation between us and the vendors is super, super important. Also, make your help site easier to search. I watch hours and hours of videos, and I retain what's relevant to what I'm doing today. And then 3 weeks from now, I'm doing something else, and I go, I remember there was this thing, this tool, and but I can't find it, because either I can't search, or the search gives me all these, public forum questions and things that are all wrong, or it was in a video somewhere, and I can't find it. Yeah, I spend a lot of time Googling stuff and searching, and I think it's just getting the user engagement. One of the things that worked really well in favor of another of your competitors that I won't mention their name is that there's such a huge user base, and people that are posting stuff online that are using the product not because they have to for work, because it's fun to make stuff. So there are even people who are just hobbyists. So there's like all these people doing these weird, great creative things and posting online. So it's really easy when I have a question to search and find something in that huge user base. And because, you know, when I first looked at Browseware and I wanted to get access to it, and they're like, we won't even give you a 30-day demo because there's no training material, so you have to have like they wanted a 3-week enterprise training and all this stuff. I just want to try it out. I want to play with it. I want to learn it. So we're making progress, and I think that's just it. Get it into people's hands. Get them using it. Get them communicating about it. We'll start sharing things. You know, the professional guild, if somehow we could figure out how to move that and get that moving some more and get more Facebook groups going and just people sharing what they're doing so that when I have a question, I can find somebody else who's doing something and they can help me so I'm not always going to support. Because that's an even better support resource is the user base, if that answers the question. Anything else? Or we're all hungry? Okay, well, I'll pass it back to Maria.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was very inspiring. We will now have some talk from Ton to explain the box from the body scan. So welcome up on stage.
Thank you.